Most families have stories that they tell and repeat over the years. Our family stories remind us of who we are and where we have come from. Our stories form our identity as a family and as a church community, and they serve as a moral compass, especially in times of great change or uncertainty. The Apostle Paul reminded the Roman Christians in the passage we heard a moment ago not to let some foreign story shape who they were as Christ's church. He wrote, "Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of the mind, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." Another translation, The Message, puts it this way: don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. We are Christ's people. We are meant to bear the mark of his cross on our lives, and we are people of hope because the story of his resurrection is our story. Paul reminded those first century Christians and us 21st century disciples to share our giftedness for Christian service. He wrote, "We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us: prophecy in proportion to faith, ministry in ministering, the teacher in teaching, the encourager in encouragement, the giver in sincerity, the leader in diligence, the compassionate in cheerfulness." This morning we tell the stories of two of our church members from the 1800s who faithfully shared their giftedness in service to others. Their stories are part of our congregation's identity. As we listen, may they challenge us to faithful service now in our 4th century of congregational life.
Good morning. Our first gospel reading this morning is from Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 to 40. "When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. And then the king will say to those at his right hand, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did it to the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me.'" May God bless this reading of the word. Most of you are familiar with Rachel Cleaver's name because our parlor down in the Scott building bears her name. And of course, she's buried in our cemetery along with other members of her family, and her grave is one of those we highlight in the information we share with those who visit our cemetery in person or those who look at the section about our cemetery on the church's website. You may also know that Rachel Cleaver is notable for her service as a missionary to the Cherokee Nation in Tennessee. I'd like to tell you some of what we know about Rachel Cleaver's mission trip and the group she traveled with, as well as the mission itself, known as Valleytown Baptist School and Mission, which is located, or was located, I should say, on the border of North Carolina and southeastern Tennessee. Valleytown Baptist Mission was a successful missionary community in the first half of the 19th century. Rachel Cleaver, along with members of her family and other members from our church, traveled together and were part of the Valleytown Baptist Mission. Valleytown included a boarding school that became an important center of Cherokee scholarship and later became part of the resistance to the ultimate removal of the Cherokee Nation from North Carolina and Tennessee in the famous Trail of Tears, when the Cherokee Indians were expelled from their ancestral homeland in the southeast and removed to the Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. In addition to having the school, Valleytown contained a model farm, a grist mill, and a blacksmith shop. This configuration was in response to conditions imposed by the Cherokee Council. The Cherokee Council said that if they were going to grant land for a mission to be established, it could not just be a school. It also had to contain a model farm because they wanted Cherokee boys to learn the skills of farming. So the Cherokee Council granted the Baptist request for land on which to start a mission, and this grant was based on their assurance that there would be both a school and a farm in Valleytown. Construction began in 1820, and the group that went to Valleytown from our church in 1821, which included Rachel Cleaver, was responding to a call by the Baptist Board for Foreign Missions for a missionary staff to put the mission in full operation after construction had begun the previous year. Here's some of what we know about the folks from our church who went to Valleytown. In addition to Rachel and her husband Isaac, the group included the pastor, Reverend Thomas Roberts, John Ferrier, Elizabeth Roberts, Elizabeth Jones, and Evan Jones. And Evan Jones is interesting because he'd not previously been a member of the church, but he was baptized and received into membership so that he could travel with the group. We believe that Evan Jones and his wife came from Wales specifically with the intention of participating in a mission. Several of these adults in the group also brought along their children, and Rachel and Isaac Cleaver took 4 of their 9 children with them on the trip. Now, I've seen 2 different accounts of how they traveled from here to Valleytown. One account says they sailed to Tennessee, but I couldn't find anything else about that, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I think the other account makes more sense, which is that they traveled by farm wagon. They departed in late September of 1821 and spent nearly 2 months on the road, traveling approximately 800 miles. From Delaware to Virginia, the road was well traveled, and they could spend the nights at the homes of other Baptists along the way. But after they left Virginia, the trip got a little more difficult. They still had 330 miles yet to go. They turned westward and climbed the Appalachians and wound along what was known as the Wilderness Road to Kentucky. And if you think about the fact that it was called the Wilderness Road, I think we have a sense of some of the difficulties they might have encountered. On this part of the journey, they often slept in their wagons, and they did not reach Knoxville, Tennessee until late in November, when the nights were already turning pretty cold. In Knoxville, they were met by a guide who took them over the rugged mountains eastward into North Carolina. And this part of the journey was especially harsh because the weather had turned quite cold and their food was getting scarce. But despite these harsh conditions, it was reported that they made the long journey without any serious illness or any serious mishaps. But when they arrived, they found that only 2 log cabins were completed. The others only had partial roofs, and the school buildings were only half done. They were consoled, however, by the fact that it was a beautiful location alongside a river that they characterized as being as wide as the Schuylkill. The land along this river valley was fertile, and there was also good hunting, and they hunted for deer, bear, wild turkey, and small game. Obtaining supplies and tools was difficult because of the isolated area, and the female mission groups back home collected supplies for them, boxes of clothing, blankets, and household goods, but these were often delayed because of the difficulties of traveling to this isolated area. Over the next 3 years, the buildings slowly were completed, but the missionaries struggled against heavy odds to make their farms productive, their homes habitable, and the grist mill functional. Despite all their hard work, they found it difficult to keep their promise to board and teach a large number of Cherokee students. However, the Cherokees remained eager for education and did what they could to assist. Although there are not a lot of records about Rachel's and Isaac's service specifically, we know a few things. Isaac was a blacksmith, and he was also a farmer. He worked in the blacksmith shop, and it's also likely that he taught blacksmithing, because we know that's something that was taught in the Valleytown schools. In addition, Rachel and Isaac together managed the model farm, and together with their sons, they worked on the model farm that we talked about before as being important for teaching Cherokee boys how to farm. The sons were actually teenagers at that time, and the records say they were brought up to farming, so I can imagine that they were probably great farmers by the time they were teenagers. Due to the hardships, most of the original group returned to this area by April of 1825. The only members of this original group to stay were the Joneses, who are the ones I mentioned before had come specifically to be missionaries. We know that Rachel and Isaac returned home in December of 1823 after serving 2 years, a little more than 2 years in the mission field. I can only imagine their joy at being reunited with the children they'd left behind. The Valleytown Mission School ultimately became the most popular of the mission schools in the Cherokee Nation because its directors adopted the Cherokee language for instruction and preaching rather than teaching and preaching in English. The school also trained Cherokee leaders who later led the opposition to the removal of the Cherokees from their land in this part of the Cherokee Nation. The story about Rachel Cleaver and her family, as well as the other members from BCGV who traveled to Tennessee, is an important reminder of the commitment to mission work and service by members of our church, both historically and continuing today. And the Valleytown approach to teaching, which included instruction in the Cherokee language and supporting leaders of the resistance to the removal of the Cherokee Nation from their land, is also a reminder of our commitment not just to service, but also to issues of justice, both then and now. That's why Rachel Cleaver's service is something that we celebrate.
Our second gospel reading is taken from Matthew 28, verses 16 through 20, sometimes called the Great Commission. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but they doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." This is good news. The Reverend Leonard Fletcher was minister of the Baptist Church in the Great Valley from 1832 to 1840. And during his ministry, reportedly baptized 448 people. He also was one of the leaders of the Chester County Wilberforce Society, which was an anti-slavery organization. The large number of baptisms performed by Reverend Fletcher occurred against the backdrop of the Second Great Awakening in the United States, which began around 1800 and ended around 1840. While this religious revival took place throughout the country, it was especially strong in the Northeast and in the South. This movement used revival meetings as an important tool in attracting interest and prompting conversions. However, the Second Great Awakening was not simply focused on individual conversion and individual spirituality. Social reform was a major concern and a major impact of this movement, and drove efforts such as women's rights, temperance, and abolition. Baptists and Methodists led many of the efforts during the Second Great Awakening. With this religious movement going on, Leonard Fletcher followed the Reverend Thomas Brown, who had a relatively brief pastorate here from 1828 to 1831. Fletcher came from Sussex, New Jersey. He had been ordained in Maryland after studying for the ministry at Columbian College. During his tenure as pastor, Reverend Fletcher not only saw great growth in the church membership, he also started several of our 7 daughter churches. Among these were First Baptist Church of Norristown in Montgomery County, 1832, the Westchester Baptist Church in Chester County, 1834, and the Williston Baptist Church in what is present-day Malvern in Chester County in 1833. A history of First Baptist Church of Norristown, published in 1897, supplies some idea of the energy that Reverend Leonard Fletcher brought to church planting in this part of Pennsylvania. It says, the Baptist cause in Norristown had its beginning with a series of meetings held in the courthouse and in the old Academy building, that was in Norristown, during the month of November 1832. These meetings were planned and conducted by the Reverend Leonard Fletcher, pastor of the Great Valley Church, Upper Marion, Chester County, PA. On the 7th of November, 1832, the following notice appeared in the Norristown Herald. It said, protracted meeting. A meeting of several days' continuance will be held at the courthouse in Norristown, commencing on Wednesday, the 7th of November at 7 p.m. Ministers of the gospel and other members of churches of every denomination are affectionately invited to aid in the services and participate in the joys of the occasion. Signed, L. Fletcher, pastor of the Baptist Church in the Great Valley, PA. Following 2 weeks of what today we would call evangelistic meetings, the ground had been prepared for organizing a new church in Norristown. An organizing meeting was held December 12, 1832, and a letter was read from the Great Valley Church dismissing 38 of its members to become part of the core membership of the new church. This pattern of church growth by hiving was followed with the founding of other new churches in the area. Congregational life during Reverend Fletcher's ministry could be contentious at times. There were controversies over temperance and especially over abolition. Fletcher was the pastor when 10 African Americans were welcomed into the membership of the church, one of whom was Phyllis Burr, whose gravesite is out in our churchyard. Fletcher began his ministry in this church in January of 1832, but by October of that year, several members asked to be dismissed from the church to form a new church in Newtown. It seems that there was more to this request, however, than a simple desire to start a new congregation, because church minutes from a meeting October 27, 1832 tells us that the action was deferred due to some, quote, unhappy circumstances. In minutes from November 5, we learned that Spicer Jones, a member since 1815 here, had charged the pastor with being a liar. A similar situation arose in 1833 when another group asked to be dismissed to join the church in Phoenixville. Again, the matter of what the minutes called disaffection with the minister was raised. One historian related to us, Harold Twiss, states that Fletcher was undoubtedly responsible for the anti-slavery movement in this region, and that he was the key person in the formation of the Wilberforce Anti-Slavery Society in Chester County. Reverend Fletcher's stance on race relations and abolition may have prompted some of the opposition that he encountered within the congregation during his tenure here. During this period, new denominations of free black churches were founded, run independently of existing congregations that were predominantly white. And we know that during the period between the American Revolution and the 1850s, black involvement in largely white churches declined in great numbers, with participation becoming almost non-existent by the 1840s to 1850s. Well, it's a good idea to remind ourselves that our heroes and our sheroes are only human after all. So on a lighter note, I share this with you. Reverend Fletcher provided a testimonial for a baldness treatment in March of 1839. If you look at the insert on your bulletin, you see that he probably felt the need for that. This was for a product called Albert's Oleaginous Hair Tonic. Described as for the growth, preservation, and restoration of the hair. This is an excellent article, the ad says, and has in numerous instances produced a fine growth of hair on the heads of persons who had been bald for years. There is now no excuse for bald heads. And then it went on to say the Reverend Leonard Fletcher, pastor of the Baptist Church at Great Valley, who had been more or less bald for many years, used 3 bottles of the hair tonic and has now a fine growth of new hair over all that part of his head where he was before bald. And Reverend Fletcher wrote, "My hair is growing finely, I assure you." Signed, L. Fletcher. In March 1840, Reverend Fletcher left the Great Valley Church to become pastor of a church in Hamilton, New York. Although he went on to serve other churches over many years, Reverend Leonard Fletcher eventually returned to this area, and he's buried in our churchyard. Standing at the gravesite of the Reverend Leonard Fletcher, his stone reads, Reverend Leonard Fletcher died August 16, 1859, in the 63rd year of his age. Peace to his memory. Remember the words I spoke unto you while I was yet with you. And so with grateful hearts, we remember his story today.